Do you know who the first woman was to ever wear bloomers? How about the first famous woman associated with wearing slacks? Have you heard of the European tradition? This was in the late 1700s, where actually wearing the least amount of clothes was the most fashionable. In fact, if everything, including your accessories, weighed over 8 ounces, that was actually unfashionable. For answers to these and many more, stay tuned for this week's episode, where I dive into 3 folders I found recently in the archives on women's wear. The first one, women's wear, coats, dresses, lingerie, suits, furs, etc. The second one, women's headwear, hats, veils, and headdresses. And the final one, women's accessories, hosiery, gloves, purses, handkerchiefs, garters, and fans. Let's dive in. Before we dive into all this great material, I'd like to ask you to hit the bell to subscribe, leave a like, leave a follow, leave a comment. I would love to hear what you think about these amazing stories, and it goes a long way to helping bring back this amazing brand to the digital age. Welcome back. This is Jeff Hicks, curator of the Strange As It Seems archives, and grandnephew of John Hicks, who created Strange As It Seems back in the late 1920s. So let's dive into this week's episode on women's fashion and clothes and such. Quite a bit here. It really a lot to dig through, but we'll start with some things in history that were kind of interesting. I love this. At the end of the 18th century, semi-poetical names were given to all fabric, trimming, and cut of women's clothes. And here's an example. A robe of stifled sighs, adorned with superfluous regrets, the point edged with perfect candor, trimmed with indiscreet complaints. How's that for poetry tied to fashion? And in the 17th century, aprons, right? Very familiar to the modern housewife. Of course, this is the modern housewife in the 1940s. An article of full dress it was, however, in the 17th century, and they often nearly touched the ground. And in answer to one of the first questions at the top, you'll never guess the name of the woman, the first woman to ever wear bloomers. Her name, Amelia Jenks Bloomer. That's how they were named. 1849, the only American woman from whom an article of feminine apparel was named was an ardent advocate of women's rights. Interestingly enough, she favored emancipation of women, even in the manner of dress. She wrote of suffrage, quote, "In the grand providential movement of the age, the individual is of little account. Divine truths from their inherent force will rule the world, but it is a triumphant joy to feel that we may aid with our might to hasten the coming of the truth." Amelia Jenks Bloomer. And as I usually find in these folders, these subjects were usually grouped together, and John Hicks, I think, started doing this to create what was known as the John Hicks scrapbook. And so he would put together a lot of Strange As It Seems that were in a subject, and this was a Sunday comic that was also well known along with Strange As It Seems. And here's one on funny feminine fashions. So we start with the Albanian women who wear balloon trousers 10 feet wide, containing 30 yards of cloth. I found that several times actually in the comic strip, even through my grandfather Ernest. They loved that one. Here's Dr. Mary Walker, early day American physician. She wore men's clothes by right of a special act of Congress that gave her the permission. This is back in 1861. How about Catherine I of Russia? She wore at her coronation a dress that weighed 150 pounds. Holy smoke. In Belgian Congo, the native woman's rank is measured by the amount of metal wire on her arms and legs. Crazy. The women of Bolivia wear 20 skirts at the same time. Crazy. And the women of Srebrenica on the Adriatic have worn black for 500 years in mourning. This is for the Frangipani family, which was defeated back in the 15th century. So here they are 400 years later, still wearing black, or 500 years later, wearing black in mourning for the family. So going back to kind of cover the first decade of Strange as It Seems in the 1930s, we already mentioned the women of Bolivia wearing 20 skirts at a time, but there was also the Matra mountain girls. They had to dress outdoors because they wear so many skirts they can't get through a door. This is in Hungary, back from 1932. And also from the 1930s, a couple of ridiculously expensive dresses here. Paulina was a Roman lady. She had a dress that cost more than $2 million. The amazing thing is she didn't even consider it one of her best. And then how about this one? Here's a $5 million dress. Crazy. It was worn by Helen Polka, made from 500 $10,000 bills. Crazy. It made of mercerized pulp. That's what it was, made from $5 million in paper money. A couple of really cool newspaper article photographs of Helen Polka here. Strange as it seems. And a couple more for the 1930s. Here's the cellophane bride, Mrs. Roy Irwin from Waco, Texas. She was married in 50 yards of cellophane. Nice, beautiful black and white photograph of the lovely cellophane bride, Mrs. Roy Irwin. And then here's one from Ireland, pretty amazing. Along the Connemara coast of Ireland, little boys used to wear skirts. The reason was they wanted to fool the evil spirits who won't capture little girls. And moving into the 1940s, the decade of still run by John Hicks, really through about 1944. He died, amazingly enough, on D-Day. June 6, 1944. Had nothing to do with the war, but he died of myocarditis and inflammation of the heart, amazingly so. But here in the John Hicks era of the 40s, we have the parachute dress, another amazing black and white photograph here, beautiful. An entire 21-yard parachute of the finest China silk was used in making this evening gown. This is the Mrs. Alfred Coffey from Fort Worth. And one from 1942 here, taken from, I love these, there's one of the favorite publications that the Hicks family used was the Illustrated London News. This is the Christmas number from 1940, but it was just an absolutely beautiful publication. On the backside was early 18th century churches of Middlesex. Absolutely beautiful, but a whole bunch of things on fashion here. And this one that they pulled was in the 1850s. Ladies had to remove their crinolines, their hoops, skirt hoops, before boarding London buses because there's no room for them inside. And maybe the longest train ever for a dress was Catherine the Great of Russia. She wore a gown with a train 225 feet long at her coronation. It took 50 train bearers to carry it. It's believed to be the longest ever worn on a dress, at least in 1944. And Alsatian women, another one from, I think, something earlier about them wearing trousers, but here is the Alsatian women. Alsatians are a race apart, never having really been absorbed by their French or German masters, and the type retains a mixture of German stolidity and French vivacity. Note the merry faces and the heavy ankles of the girls. The chief feature of their costume is a big bow of black silk, like some insect on their heads, and religious differences may be recognized at once by their short skirts. And this was the amazing fact here. Alsatian women wear green skirts if they're Protestants, and red skirts if they're Catholics. And moving on into the Ernest Hicks era of the late 1940s, you can always tell what the Ernest Hicks comics, because the art changed, the subject matter changed a little bit. My grandma used to always tell me that my grandfather was a bit of a rake, as she would say it. My mom used the word womanizer. How's that? But you could kind of tell. Here's a couple right early. August of 1945. Until the 14th century in Europe, women never wore nightgowns, and queens went to bed with only their crowns on. And then, of course, the naked fashion. Here's another one from 1946. A European fad, 1795 to 1800, decreed that all a lady's clothes, including accessories, should not weigh more than 8 ounces, and the women who wore the least were the best dressed, and of course a a evocative, I should say, provocative, however you want to put it, illustration here of the naked fashion from 1946. And of course, we're on into the Ernest Hicks era. Here's another one. It was a sin for Spanish women to show their feet, so they wore skirts long enough to walk on. That was a feat that required special instruction. We have, at her death, Queen Elizabeth. Apparently she left a wardrobe of 2,000 gowns. Some are worth $10,000 each. Queen Elizabeth, kind of amazing there. Here's a fact from Shanghai, China. For years, Shanghai Chinese tailors could develop tailor-made suits in 24 hours, and the headline for this was, "It should happen here." Crazy. How about early California women? They wore Paris gowns and satin slippers. Amazing. Maybe not so amazing, but the amazing part was their homes were made of mud with dirt floors and cowhide doors. But they had the finest in Paris fashion, apparently, in California at the time. Back in England, Edward III, the era of him, he decreed that women had to be, basically, to wear furs, they had to be blameless or at least of noble birth to be able to wear the noble furs. Crazy. How about the women of Champéry, Switzerland? They've been wearing slack suits for almost 100 years, and this was kind of the era that started to get into slacks, pants. This was sort of like the amazing fashion. This is another one of those illustrations that a little bit racy by the artist that Ernest worked with. 100-year-old slack suits, and I guess this kind of bled in to the Elsie Hicks era, because this is pretty amazing. But I guess the famous person, the reason why women wear slacks or started wearing slacks was because of Marlene Dietrich. She was an amazing figure in history too. She first suggested that when she met with press photographers dressed in slacks, and the idea was turned down flat, not a chance. Later, seeing gardening slacks displayed in a Hollywood department store, her publicity man thought it worth a try, but little did he realize that her photographs would start a whole new fad in women's wearing apparel. This is from my grandma Elsie, who took over the comic strip. Pretty amazing that women nowadays, obviously, that's the standard wear, especially for politics, women in politics, right? They all have pantsuits, but it started with Marlene Dietrich, and far be it for Ernest Hicks to miss another possible article on women being naked or close to naked, and in this case they were naked. Professional girl dancers of the Amazon, kind of amazing. Girl dancers among the Amazon Indians practice dancing as a profession and are trained for it. They perform continuously at weddings, but they dance entirely naked, except it's hardly noticeable because they have garish costumes painted on. You see that a lot today. A lot of women kind of painting suits on their naked bodies, but this apparently happened in the Amazon for generations previously. Amazing. A little article here and comic strip from the 1940s. Hungarian girls, also from the Ernest Hicks era, they wore knee-length skirts under which were 20 petticoats. Crazy. I don't know how these women wore so many clothes. And the final one here from the Ernest Hicks era, and it looked like it was, I think Elsie found one as well, maybe a different person. But here's a woman who created a dog's hair suit, purse, and hat. This is Doris Marie Cook, made entirely of material woven from the combings of her 3 pet Samoyed dogs. Her father, E.H. Cook, combed them 3 times a week, and in a year and a half, she had saved 10 pounds of hair. Article here in the July 1945. Amazing. This goes all the way back to the 1940s, and a letter from the Interstate Samoyed Club, and it looks like Elsie also found somebody in the 1950s. Here's Mrs. L.W. Empey of Green Bay, Wisconsin, and she knitted a suit from hand-spun yarn, also made from the silvery white combings of her Samoyed dog. Still have the letter from Elsie. Sometimes they would just write back in response, and I'd get the original letter, which I love to save as well. And another from the very beginning of Elsie's era, you could always tell because right after my grandfather died in a plane crash in 1948, Elsie took over the comic strip, and for the first few months, it just said "Strange as It Seems" by Hicks before she put her name to it. And that's how you know. And here's the top American designers fashioning smart clothes from surplus Army and Navy blankets. Quite a few photographs here from the top American designers fashioning quite beautiful clothes here, basically from surplus blankets from the Army and Navy. Here's another one as well with a man's suit. Amazing. This is pretty cool. Amazingly, here's a letter. This is from the Elsie Hicks era, and the final one from this folder. The Colburns Furs Exclusively. William Colburn wrote a letter confirming this fact. She said he said, your letter of April 14th was received and contents carefully noted. Approximately 4 to 5 pounds of pins may be used by a furrier in the assembly of a single mink coat. She had heard it was 10 pounds, but it was still 4 to 5 pounds. Crazy. As many as 5 pounds of pins used by a furrier to assemble a fur coat. Next, we'll move into the second folder here, women's headwear, hats, veils, and headdresses. And as usual, each subject had a John Hicks scrapbook, which pulled together, in this case, looked like about 7 different John Hicks comics from the 1930s, but strange headdresses. Here's the South African belles who wear their hair on bamboo frameworks, 18 inches long, kind of a spoon-shaped hairpin is used to scratch the scalp. Kind of crazy headdress there. The Bulgarian bridal headdress, ornamented with flowers with a tapestry of silver coins, covers the face. Crazy. Lightning rod hats. How about these? I found this also the comic strip for that one as well, but that's a crazy one. In the 18th century France, a thin metallic ribbon was supposed to protect the wearer during storms. Crazy. Yeah, here it is from 1930. Looks like also, 1930, maybe 31. The lightning rods. Here it is. When lightning rods were worn on hats, the fashionable lady of nearly 2 centuries ago wore a lightning conductor consisting of a ribbon woven of metal thread encircling the hat, to which was attached a silver cord long enough to drag on the ground and give him a ground. Crazy. Then the other side of this John Hicks scrapbook, there was mud plastered onto the hair that provided Mongolian women with lifetime hats. Here we go. The tent hat worn by Korean women, used as a wardrobe trunk when occasion demands. And this crazy one, my family loved this Tonkin hat. The strange headdress signifies that the Tonkinese woman is married. This is incredible. It was featured here by Ernest Hicks. Here's a drawing of it. Goes all the way back to 1930. The headdress of the Tonkinese. Also found a really cool from the American Weekly from 1929. I guess that's when John Hicks first found that out. Probably the first year of Strange as It Seems. But to show that she's married, really amazing headdress there of the Tonkinese women. And then the final one, the elaborate headdress reached an all-time high 200 years ago in Europe. This was also featured, it's like in 1933. On top of it was a pillow. This was a Paris favorite hat, and found this awesome full length. How about this from 1931? I love these full length. On the back we have an amazing ad here for a little tobacco ad. It so happens I don't smoke, but I've noticed recently that more of my girlfriends are smoking Chesterfield, and I asked why. One of them said Chesterfields really are milder and taste better. There's nothing strong or sharp or bitter about them. What a beautiful Chesterfield ad, but check this out. Lacquered hair women's newest freak fashion. Varnished wigs and coxcomb coiffures. Straight from the Congo, the latest of the grotesque modes with which woman has for centuries tried to appease her basic savage instincts. Crazy, but this is where apparently that women who wear their hair with that pillow on top illustration came from. But what a beautiful 1931 newspaper. I should get that framed. There's so many of these I should have framed. I don't have enough walls. And a few more of the amazing hats in this folder. Here's the tantour. Until recent years, worn by the Druze women of Asia Minor. And the bridegroom placed it on her head at the wedding and never took it off again her entire life, not even to go to bed. I love this, the badge of polyandry. I love this word, I've heard it before. There's several cultures where women were allowed to have several husbands, believe it or not. And this is another one, the woman who doesn't change her hat. In some hill tribes of Tibet, a woman wears a headdress of wool and cane decorated with turquoise and coral to show that she has more than one husband. Crazy. Look at that, hill tribes of Tibet. And another from the Ernest Hicks era. Here's the war bonnets. Amazing. The biggest surprise to the Yanks who entered Paris in 1944 for World War II was the huge size of the women's hats. Yet, virtually the same enormous headgear style was popular in Paris all the way back in 1917. And the final ones here on hats, we've got an Arab woman is actually ashamed to expose her face, of course, but even more ashamed to expose the back of her head. That's a crazy fact. Here are the baby skirt headdresses. These are 100 years ago, baby dresses from a wrecked ship washed ashore at Tehuantepec, Mexico. And the Tehuana Indian women liked them, but they didn't know what they were, so they put them on their heads, and today they remain a part of their national costume. Crazy. Oh, and by the way, here's the, it's not mandatory, well, let's say compulsory for women to wear hats at the Royal Enclosure of Britain's Ascot racehorses. And here we have confirmation from Topham's Limited, the racehorse offices. We just did one recently, or actually 2 episodes recently on horse racing. Could have used this one as well. But in reply to your letter dated April 1st, 1952, we would refer you to the manager and clerk of the course at Ascot for a definite ruling regarding ladies' hats. It would be most unusual for a lady not to wear a hat in the royal enclosure. And the final one from my grandma Elsie. This is a traditional hat worn by the women of the Black Forest, Germany. Weighs 7 pounds. And here's a delightful little postcard with that hat shown here from the Black Forest of Germany. And a few in this folder too that weren't hats, but were actually about veils. Here's an interesting one. The lady driver's mask in the French tradition. This goes back to 1900, and a little hand-drawn drawing here, as well as comic strip that it appeared. Amazing. We have the veil, really interesting veil from Oman, Arabia. Very interesting looking veil there. And actually the history of the veil is kind of interesting, right? It was an Oriental custom of wearing veils. And here's the story kind of written out here. Pretty amazing. That Muhammad instituted veiling, or copied it, was primarily for personal reasons. He was beginning to get on in years. Most of his wives were less than half his age. They were attractive, good-looking, warm-blooded girls with instincts peculiar to normally developed females. Male visitors were continually dropping by to visit Muhammad. Some came with petitions, religious problems, etc., but quite a number made their calls with little other purpose than to have a look at the messenger's young ladies. None of this escaped Muhammad, but it was difficult to keep such visitors away from his quarters without some definite instructions. He accordingly turned, as he always did in moments of emergency, to his God, and received a revelation which is recorded in the 6th of the 5th sutra, verse of the Quran as follows: O ye believers, enter not into the apartment of the prophet except ye be called to sup with him, without waiting his convenient time. When ye are bidden, then enter, and when ye have eaten, then disperse, and stay not for familiar converse. When ye ask anything of the prophet's wives, ask it from behind a curtain. The origin of the veil in Arab tradition. And the final folder here, women's accessories, hosiery, gloves, purses, handkerchiefs, garters, and fans. Let's dive into this final folder here. I'm going to start off with the accessories from this folder. Pretty interesting before we get into the silk stockings and such. Quite a bit on stockings here, but this is pretty amazing. The Jealousy lorgnettes, they were the fashion in Louis XV's time. There was a hidden mirror arrangement which allowed theater goers to look forward but observe the audience to the side and the right, so they could look at the people in the audience rather than the show up on stage. And here's a pretty amazing piece of equipment here. This is by the grand piano player Hélène Bayon, a Canadian pianist, but it's the grand piano compact, and apparently it can only be opened by playing an octave on it, and inside. The compact are the usual beautifying accessories, as confirmed here by Anthony Boutita of Constance Hope Associates, the grand piano compact. And here a delightful handwritten letter from Gertrude Olshan, and a photograph as well to help in drawing her for the comic strip. But she's apparently carried the same lace handkerchief for 20 years. With people losing handkerchiefs every day, I'd like to report my own experience. I'm using the same handkerchief for 20 years. It's a Swiss embroidered handkerchief given to me as a gift when I graduated from grade school in June of 1912 in Chicago. Since then, I've traveled through the East and South for years for business and pleasure, but always carrying this same handkerchief. Is this strange? Well, it certainly was strange enough to include in the comic strip. And then on to silk stockings. Quite a bit here on silk stockings. And apparently the first woman to wear silk stockings was Queen Elizabeth. They were knitted by hand. And quite a few fascinating communications here from the real silk hosiery mills in Indianapolis, including this pretty amazing brochure here, The Legend of Silk. I'll go ahead and scan this in and attach it, but fascinating history here. They read through on the history of silk, and I love this too. Here is a full length from the Los Angeles Sunday Times of 1937. Here is how silk stockings are made. And at the bottom, I love this too, a couple of guys racing behind speedboats all the way from Catalina to Manhattan, Hermosa Beach. Oh, that's a pretty grueling event there, but just the whole process right there of how silk stockings are made. They're knitted flat, then there's the legger machine, the footer machine, and to the boarding room, and the looping machine, and then to the boarding room. Fascinating process on how they're made. And one of the amazing facts pulled for 1937 from all this material, one silk stocking contains 32 miles of silk, strange as it seems. And another one from 1931 here, apparently tin cans were used in making silk hose, although we got this letter from the same real silk hosiery mills of, may I please have a reply to my letter of November 6th. This is quite important from my point of view, and a prompt answer would be appreciated. It looks like he was kind of challenging that fact. And apparently John Hicks responded with the 1930 edition of the World Book Encyclopedia, which states the following: silk is subjected to a process of loading, which if carried to excess is objectionable. Natural silk in its raw state is covered with a gummy substance which gives it a harsh feeling and a yellow, unsightly appearance. When this material is removed by washing the skeins of silk, about 4 ounces are lost per skein. The fiber is then brought back to its original weight by the deposition of tin phosphate. The tin used for this purpose is obtained by detinning tin cans and other waste tin scrap. Silk fiber may be so loaded with this tin that the original pound of fiber may become almost double that weight. Crazy. And here's a pair of fleur-de-lis lace hose sold for $500 a pair. Apparently the most expensive hose in the world, and a delightful photograph in the Philadelphia Record from 1930. And another one from John Hicks era, apparently because the Grand Duchess Maria of Russia, she was required to wear extremely plain clothes as a child, and so one of the reasons she wanted to get married was so she could wear silk stockings, and There you go. Here's another one from 1933, that 12 pairs of sheer hose can be drawn through a finger ring at the same time. Amazing. And perhaps my favorite find, treasure. There's always some treasures in these files, but this one really I love. So it's late 1930s, 1939, when a huge change in women's wear was affected by the invention of a substance, and it was basically put in 1939 that silk stockings can be made from air, water, and coal. And that was actually this amazing new invention. And here's a letter from DuPont, as well as the whole article behind it. But thanks for the proof. There's an entirely new synthetic material, which is the greatest development in textile fiber since the introduction of rayon. And the new substance was called, as you can see by this full-length ad, also included by DuPont, that announces for the world of tomorrow a new word and a new material: nylon. And the final one that got me laughing here, this is pretty cool. Here's a honey of As Strange as It Seems. This came from Irving Rubin, Willies of Hollywood, who designs stockings for top cinema stars. The guy who does it, I guess, Willies of Hollywood, he's an ex-pug who fought under the name Willie Dumond. So kind of crazy. Here's a great picture of Willie Dumond. Started out as a boxer, strange as it seems. Willies of Hollywood, famous today as the designer of the fabulously sheer and exotically styled hosiery worn by the Hollywood stars, both on and off the screen, was at one time amateur boxing champion of the country. At the age of 15, he won the national flyweight title and was chosen for the 1920 Olympic team. Amazing. His family, who only then found out that their son was boxing, put a stop to his pugilistic career at this point. He had fought 86 fights, won by knockouts, 23 by decisions, and then he ended up becoming famous for designing women's hose. Strange as it seems. Well, that wraps it up for this episode on women's wear, found from these fascinating folders in the Strange as It Seems archives. Please hit the bell to subscribe. Leave a like, leave a follow, leave a comment. We'd love to hear what you think about some of these amazing facts pulled from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s archives in Strange as It Seems. And I'll be back next week with another episode. Got a few folders down here on statesmen, interestingly enough, English, Irish, non-European, and even some of the dictators and rulers of the 1930s and 40s. Fascinating. But before I leave, I'll leave you with this quote from Jeff Hicks, also from his 1928 book that he first published back at the beginning of Strange as It Seems, where the author launches this book of the curious in nature and humankind. Launched on the vast sea of public opinion with the hope that it will fulfill its mission to entertain and acquaint its readers with some of the marvels of the world in which we live.